There we are. We're live. Everybody, welcome to the Gamification Revolution. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman, coming to you from the beautiful, sunny New York City. And we are joined by Richard Bartle, who looks like he's in a slightly less sunny version of England. Hi, Richard. Welcome.
Hello. Yes, it would be sunny here if it were 3 or 4 hours earlier, but the sun's gone down now. It'll happen to you soon.
What do you mean the sun goes down? That's crazy. I thought the sun never sets on England. I want to kick off, of course, Richard. Richard's a legend who needs very little introduction, but I have kind of an opening question for you, Richard. And we'll talk some about your
Mhm.
background and the history that brings us to this. But since the kind of start of the gamification movement and this past year at Gamification Summit and in other places, you've given a talk where you've talked about how your player type model that's quite famous that you developed isn't exactly a good fit with gamification. Can you give us a sense of why you say that there might be some mismatch between those two things?
Uh, it's not so much that I see that there's a mismatch. It's just that I've got no. Um, see, with an academic background, I want to be able to explain why things are the way they are, and the original paper from which the player types thing came was all from watching people playing. Well, back then they were text mods, but now they'd be MMOs. Uh, and from that, um, I developed the theory, but there was no justification for it. It was like, look, this is what I've seen. Tell me what's wrong. And after a while, it seemed that people were just telling me what's right. There didn't seem to be any. They were saying, yeah, that fits what we've observed, but I wanted to know why. So I looked at it and I managed to come up with an explanation which fits really well what happens in an MMO. It's just that it doesn't fit what happens in anything else. So although see, as an academic, I can't say this works for MMOs, so it works for everything else. All I can say is this works for MMOs, so it works for MMOs. That doesn't mean it doesn't work for anything else, but it does mean that I have to be cautious because I don't want to make claims that aren't true. Now, it may be that it does work. It's just that I can't see how. I can't see. It's that I have no explanation for why it would work, or indeed why it wouldn't.
Well, so tell us what are player types all about? Why do we even need player types?
Okay, so back in the early '90s when I started work on this, um, when the internet was roamed by dinosaurs, the when people were creating games, they created games that they personally wanted to play. So if you were a game designer, it was because you were creating games that you thought would be fun to play. But although that's got a reasonable justification if it's a single player game, because um, at least one person's going to want to play it, and there might be lots of other people with the same idea as the designer. For a multiplayer game, there were there were different types of people who had to interact together. You had to have all of them in a different mix for it to work. And the whole point of my paper was just to point out that there are these other different, that it didn't have to be these, just there are different types of players. You're not creating a game just for yourself, you're creating a game for lots of people, some of whom might not even have, you might not like what they're doing, but if they're not in the mix, then it's not going to be, it's not going to work. So it's like if you're making a meal and you think, oh yeah, I really like, I don't know, corned beef or something. I'm gonna tuck into corned beef and I'm gonna make a meal consisting entirely of corned beef. Well, you and all the other corned beef lovers will really love that meal, but some people might think, well, maybe it needs like some vegetables, or maybe it needs a little salsa, or maybe it needs
So here's a
arsenic or
question.
whatever.
Yeah, is that controversial fundamentally, the idea that there are these different player types, or is most of the controversy really about what are they and how do they act?
Originally, the when it first was announced, it wasn't. Um, there was no controversy. I was expecting it to be shot down within 6 months, but what happened was people were started to justify it. Now, it's been applied to many other things since then, not just gamification, but many other areas, and some of them are pretty spacey. But gamification is one of the more sane applications. It's probably the sanest, apart from MMOs and games, then gamification. And then when you follow it on, you get to the really strange ones, neurolinguistic programming and things. But I mean, so there's no controversy over that. In terms of gamification, I wouldn't say that there was controversy either. But what I would argue is that what player types show you is that there are different types of people who want to engage with whatever it is you're gamifying. At the moment, my player types are maybe the best tools in the toolbox, but there are probably better tools that yet to be invented for the toolbox. All player types has really done is showed that if you accept that there are different people with different ways of looking at things, then you can present your products or your ideas or your motivations or whatever for the whole range. And if you want a community to build around it, which is good. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no. So we're here, with, of course, Professor Richard Bartle, the creator of Bartle Player Types, the Gamification Revolution. I'm Gabe Zickerman. If you have questions, you can click the chat box or even come on screen. If you've got a camera, you can ask Richard or me any of the questions that you might have. And we're really super excited to have you here, Richard, and dig into all of this work. And of course, we've got some questions already immediately. And this question comes from Kez Sampanthar, who's also a speaker at Gamification Summit and an expert on the subject. And what Kez wonders is whether or not you've seen any other kind of research that you think might be interesting or a good fit to think about in terms of gamification in player types. He mentions Norrie and Lawrence's motivational framework, or obviously Deci and Ryan and self-determination theory. Are there other frameworks that you think might be applicable that may either mesh or come into conflict with the work that you've done?
It depends it all depends on what you want to get out of things. What I would say is look at the different things and see if they seem plausible to you. See, because my main research area is virtual worlds, I'm not I don't go and read everything about gamification, so I'm not going to I mean, for these here, I mean, Noria and Lawrence is driven. Now, that looks like it's something that if I were a gamification geek, I would know. But sadly, I'm not a gamification geek. I'm actually a game designer. So I'm actually completely ignorant of that. So I could try and bluff it, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to fess up. I don't know.
I think it's one of the, and I think that's great, and thank you for not bullshitting. One of the interesting kind of things about what we do, which I think has been sometimes difficult for people to wrap their heads around, is that we're trying to come up with this design discipline drawing from different areas. So, for example, drawing from game design, drawing from loyalty programs, and then drawing from behavioral economics and psychology, which is what most of the research that Kez is talking about comes from organizational development, psychology, and behavioral econ. And so in this area, what we try to do is sort of put together the experts who have their different kind of views of the world and understand each one of those different prisms. And so one of the things that comes up in your base work that I think is a very interesting prism for us to think about, and thanks for that question, Kez, by the way, is the question of killers and killer behavior. It's obviously, it elicits immediate, titillation whenever we talk about it, whenever we bring up Bartle's player types, and of course the basic ones, and I know you've expanded them, but from the basic achiever, explorer, socializer, killer quad. Killer always gets people going, ha, 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 and it's easy to tell jokes about them. But when you talk about the killer, when you think about a killer persona, what do you mean by that? What is the killer in your view?
Um, okay. Uh, Again, taking a meal analogy, if you've got a meal and you're eating it and it doesn't taste, it tastes kind of bland, and you add a bit of pepper to it, that can really make the meal taste nice. The pepper's like the killers, but you don't want to empty your whole pepper pot on it because then you can't eat it. So you just need a bit, because the killers, what the killers do is they're like the grit in the oyster. They're the ones that cause, if not drama, but they cause events. Things happen around them which enable the rest of the community to join together. Now, that's in a shared world kind of context. Now, for gamification, it may be that your individual um, gamified people are not aware of, or they can't interact with all the others. In which case, why would you need killers? Well, the answer is because you're going to get them whether you like it or not. There are always people who are going to be trying to undermine your system or poke holes in it or just troll the forums or anything like that, because some people are like that. Therefore, if you know they're going to do it, then it's best to channel them in areas which would be useful for you and probably useful for them. Also, over time, people aren't, well, I suppose psychopaths might be, but most people don't remain killers forever. They develop from killer into something else. Also, when you this is the classic griefer kind of killer. There is you mentioned that there's the 8 type model which applies for MMOs, but what that does, it splits the killer quadrant into 2. One of them is kind of like it's politicians rather than griefers. So they're people who want to impose themselves on other players, but they're kind of doing it for reasons of trying
Megalomania.
to help the community. Yeah. No, that's not how they see it. No, no. But yes, and it's good to have people like that because they organise everybody else and they whip them up to get them to do things that the community needs. And so you need some kind of organisers. I mean, there would be guild leaders in an MMO context. In your context, there might be people who are prominent posters on the forum who are trying to persuade you to sell more shoes or something, whatever they're trying to do.
So of course, as I had hypothesized, killers immediately cause a whole bunch of reaction. And so we have a question here from Keith Eng. Thank you, Keith, for your question. Actually, 2 questions. And the first one is, given Keith talked about a 1% number for killers, but whatever the number is, most people believe that they form a relatively small percentage of the ecosystem of a given interaction, like an MMO. So, but how important is their contribution? It sounds like you think they make a pretty big contribution.
They make a contribution that's out of all proportion to their numbers, certainly, because they are I wouldn't say that they were their actions have more effect than most people's actions. The ripples go further. But there is like a Malthusian thing going on. So if you get too many of them, then they start to interact with each other, and then they'll kill each other off. I wouldn't say that they were predators, because actually they can be beaten or thrashed or whatever else. They can be taken down by explorers. Explorers know more about whatever the system is, and whenever their killers engage explorers, the explorers will really wipe the floor with them because they just know more, because they understand everything. So killers are mainly interested in tormenting socializers, which gives the socializers a sense of belonging, if you like, because now they're not just visitors. Now there's some guy who's a bit of a jerk, and they they sort of get invested in whatever the world in my case, but the virtual world in my case, but whatever the environment is, because they feel it's real. They feel that there's people there and they should be stopped and so on. It gives them a something about which to socialize.
There's a kind of
But
us
too many
versus
of them,
them
and
dynamic that exists a lot
yeah,
in sociology, right?
yeah.
The
I mean, there
formation.
was there was a movie set in the Second World War. Basically, there was this a captain was holed up in his ship up the river in China, and his ship was small, and the battleships waiting to shoot him as he came out, but um, but they couldn't get up the river, so he was trapped there. So he had to keep his men occupied on the ship, and he kept giving them pointless things to do. And so eventually these guys all hated him because, he was telling them to scrub the decks when they just scrubbed the decks, and this time do it from left to right using a toothbrush and all this sort of thing. So all the people there really hated him, but because they hated him, that gave them a focal point about which to direct their anger. So eventually they were all unified and could be led. So killers are like that. They I mean, that's not how they see it themselves, but
Sure. So obviously, as you're talking about it, and giving these analogies, and we're talking about the socializer and the killer and how they interact with each other, and the explorer and their power, and I want to talk some more about that. It's so easy to take this model and project it onto the world outside of MMO. I mean, every fiber of my being wants to take this and say, I know the achiever type of friend. I've got a three killer friends, and who the socializers are and all that. Why shouldn't we do that?
I wouldn't say that you shouldn't do that. You feel free. All I'm saying is that if you do that, I'd kind of like to know how it works, because I don't know why it would work. I mean, when I was at the Gamification Summit, what I said, it was a bit like as if I'm like a fiction writer, and I've written a system for writing stories. And if you follow this system, then it'll make you have better stories. And then people have taken it and applied it to newspaper stories, which are non-fiction, so shouldn't work there. But it does work there, and I don't know why, because it was. But if it does work, well, I'm not going to argue. Just that I wouldn't know why. And it's like this for player types. I mean, there are almost certainly much better player type models than mine for the world in general. But if no one's come up with them yet, then yeah, okay, well, mine's like a reasonable working prototype that from which you might be able to divine better understanding.
So let's extrapolate for a second. And of course, I should remind everybody
Mm-hmm.
watching that the next Gamification Summit will be coming up April 16th through the 18th in San Francisco. It's gsummit.com. If you want to watch Richard's video, amazing talk, hilarious talk. The audience was on the floor, and awesome from last year, also at gsummit.com. But so Richard, here's the question that I guess. Let's blue sky for 1 second. So as generations of people have been more influenced by games, like really the games on which your player type model were built, do you think there's some kind of potential for the life imitating art? So perhaps you've unleashed this kind of, you observe this structure, and this structure is now going to reflect back on culture, and the achievers, explorers, socializers, and killers are effectively being trained into those boxes by games?
Yeah, there is a danger of that. Yes, with MMOs, people are now routinely designing MMOs to have player types in them, and they design the MMOs, and people play in them, and lo and behold, they all fit the player types. So it shows that my model must work. But of course it works, because you designed the game to fit the player types. So there might be people falling through cracks that we don't know about. So if people are designing to fit a model, then it should come as no surprise that the people who are still around, um, are the ones for whom the model fits, but other people might not fit. So it could be that gamification works better on people who have played games because not no my I'm not saying gamification. I mean my player types model, when applied to gamification, might work in part because many of the people know what a game is and they instinctively know about this, and player types is well known amongst the game design community. So you could well have a point there, but it would only take a better model, and all that would fall apart.
Do you think so? We've talked about the socializer a little bit. We talked about the killer a little bit. We found out there's a hidden power to explorers, which is if I had to choose one of the categories, I seem to always fall into is that one. So I like knowing I can kill a killer. But let's talk about the achievers for a second because they get a disproportionate amount of attention. I think it's fairly easy, especially to think about kind of gamification in simple form, which normally, we talk about points and badges as the kind of, dismissive view of that low-level version of gamification. A lot of that is targeted at an achiever kind of audience. What are some of the gotchas about that group of people? What does a designer really need to take into consideration? Even if you just want to talk about MMOs in terms of the achiever mentality and the achiever orientation.
Well, the achiever is um, your regular game player is not is the achiever. If people think of a game player, they're typically thinking of an achiever, somebody who's playing to try and win, and that's competition. And many people are just naturally competitive. Whether it's in playing games or whether it's in politics or whether it's in finance or regular work or whatever. People are competitive, and games give them a way to be competitive without feeling too bad if they lose. Uh, but uh, because much of what gamification um, started with came out of games, which, the, the first, like the low-hanging fruit, if you like, were all the achiever um, activities. So they were the first ones that people would get. So yeah, badges, points, and from that, we get this vanilla gamification, which is mainly about achievers. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but if you want to widen it to apply to other people, then well, they aren't achievers. They are other types, socializers and killers and explorers. In my keep saying my, but I don't really actually like calling it my player types model, but the player types model.
It does have your name on it though, so it's hard to get away from that.
Well, I never put my name on it, and I'm like Peter Higgs. He's the only person in the world who doesn't call it the Higgs boson. I mean, I don't. It's kind of self-aggrandizing.
So here's a question for you related to that. Actually, I know you've got a lot more to say on the achievers. We'll come back to them, I'm sure. Kyle asked a question.
I can talk about this forever.
Yeah, and you know what? I could too. I love talking to you. So Kyle asked this question. I hope I'm saying your name right, Kyle. It's a kind of long question, but really about the interaction, the differences in play interactions from before, from let's say a generation ago until now. And I often talk about how the games I played were quite different. When I was a child, even the video games in the early end, to the games that I play now. So from your perspective, as you see kind of player motivation, player style, and so on, have you observed any changes in like how we need to design or what we need to design for from say the 90s until now or the 80s until
now? The thing with game design, and I would suspect with gamification as well, is the most important thing you need when you're creating a game is to know who's going to play it. That's the single most important thing. Now, back in the 90s, the kind of people who were going to play games weren't the kind of people who are going to be playing games now. It was a much smaller audience. There were people more dedicated to games. They'd have played board games, Dungeons and Dragons, whatever. They'd have played lots of games typically, and when they saw computers, because they were more the early adopter types, they would be interested in that. I mean, back then, the kind of people who would play games would either be families sitting around at Christmas time or whatever, sitting around a board, boring themselves rigid with Monopoly, or they could be uh, with a nod in the direction of the gamification summit guy, obviously. It can be thrilling if you're the one who's winning, but most of the people who regarded themselves as gamers were people who were of a particular, I won't say mindset, but they like particular things. So when you were creating a game back then, you were creating games that were for people with lots of imagination, for people who like systems, for people who maybe it could be a bit geeky, or they could be just people who like history or whatever. I mean, an SPI game would be different to a role-playing game, so but there were these different camps, but you knew your audience. Now, because everybody has access to devices which have got games on them, if you're designing a game, well, who are you designing it for? If,
Right.
you might be still designing for the old hardcore, but you might also be designing for a very wide audience, and so the wider it is, then the less sophisticated you can make it, because it's got to attract more people. So it's really who you're aiming at. And similar with gamification, if you've got a very small niche of people who like watches, and you think, right, I'm going to try and sell, or I'm going to try and advertise, I'm going to try and win over these people who like watches, then the gamification you would do for that would be different for gamification for buying strawberries.
We often talk about also on the enterprise side, and thanks for that question, Kyle, and Sasha has a question for us on the enterprise side, but I usually give the example of, if we were designing a behavioral intervention for a group of stockbrokers, we might design that differently from, for example, a group of, nannies who might have
Yeah.
some of the same inherent qualities, right? They've got their own competitive natures and their own social natures and their own explorer natures and their own killer natures. But in general, we're likely to find a greater degree of that kind of achiever killer, highly outward facing, action oriented group among the stockbrokers than we would among the nannies. And Sasha really asks this question, which I just want to make even broader. And he asked, which is about how we determine the player types. And I guess, Richard, there's obviously one or two quizzes online that you can use to kind of take your player type, based, I guess, loosely or directly on the questions that you used in some of your original research. What about efforts to broaden that and turn that into more of a standard kind of psychological measure?
There are some, and gamification is kind of leading the way here. I know this because I keep getting emails every once in a while from people saying, do you mind if I create a test for some subgroup, midwives or something? And I say, no, go ahead. You don't need my permission. That's part of the thing of academia. It's out there. You can do what you like with it. So there are tests out there, but none that are just that I know of that are just here. Click on this and it'll tell you. There are also some people who are see, if you've got a test, people see the test and they think, which is the best? Explorer or achiever or whatever. So they'll think so they'll answer the questions to try and be that. But there are ways around that. For example, one way is, instead of asking them questions which basically amount to, are you an achiever, an explorer, a socializer, or a killer, you ask them questions which are to do with, do you like people, or do you like the environment? Do you like telling people what to do, or do you like engaging with people? And if you ask them like using the axes, then you'll get it's harder for them to trick to choose which one they want to be. And another way of doing it is you can design games. So people play a game, and while they're playing the game, it's gathering data on them. And when they finish the game, it says, you are a achiever, or that would be an achiever. And you can do that with other things as well. If you wanted the Myers-Briggs type indicator, you could design a game which, when people played it, would tell you what maybe 3, perhaps not all 4 the indicators are. So there are ways you can get over that rather than just do a quiz, although quizzes are obviously fun, yes.
And with that, Richard, I want to tell you again, just like you, I could spend all day certainly talking to you, talking about the subject. And I want to thank you so much, Richard Bartle, for joining us today on Gamification Revolution. Our time's up for today. We have got another couple of episodes before, yeah, the 30 minutes goes so fast. We've got another couple of episodes before the end of the year, and joining us are some other august names in gamification and game design. So be sure to come back and see us again on these upcoming Mondays. And just as a reminder, the early bird deadline for G Summit 2013 is coming up at the end of this week. And if you want to catch Richard, you can, of course, hit gsummit.com and watch his amazing, amazing talk from last year's event. And again, thanks so much, Richard. Thanks to all of you. I'm Gabe Zickerman. This is the Gamification Revolution. Keep having fun.